Thank you to Books Are Magic, and thank you to the writers who are here tonight on this panel, and to the audience members joining us from all over, including my students from the new school who are here tonight. I'm teaching a class on writing about parents this fall, so this topic is particularly of interest to me, also because of the anthology that I put together. I came up with the idea of Red Ink, a panel that focuses on women writers, several years ago. And when I was trying to come up with a name for it, the writer and book publicist Lauren Sarand knew that Virginia Woolf is one of my favorite writers and suggested the title Red Ink, which comes from a quote from Mrs. Dalloway. He thought her beautiful, believed her impeccably wise, dreamed of her, wrote poems to her, which, ignoring the subject, she corrected in red ink. So that's where the name of this series comes from. And I wanted to start out tonight by asking everyone on the panel, what does the topic of family mean to you as a writer? And how relevant is the idea of family in your work? So whoever wants to go first and jump right in.
For me, it was central. I wrote my book with the hypothesis that regardless of the situations and scenarios in which any family is placed in, and regardless of the external labels that we put on what this family is, all families at their core struggle with the same issues and survive through the same strengths of love and resilience. And so I see my book as a dedication to both a celebration of childhood and a celebration of family.
Yeah, I've written a lot about my family. My first memoir, which was like 15 years ago, was about my relationship with my mother. And I always sort of felt like, for me, it was writing about loving relationships and not about toxic relationships, which just I was lucky enough to have, and making sure that I felt like anybody who read them would feel okay about it instead of hating me. So I tried to write with love about family, because they are the ones who sort of keep coming back, but not everybody feels that way, I know.
I would say that one of the most central ideas to my thinking around writing and editing as well is contrast, which I got from Virginia Woolf. Like, that was the first time where I ever heard that idea, that contrast was super important. And this was very early in my trajectory as a writer. And I thought, well, there's no place where I feel more contrast than in the space of my own family and in my experience, the sort of intense love and protection that's there. And yet the contrast between thinking about the family as a unit and the individual within the family, which was something that was really rife for me in my experience being queer in my family. I just felt like there was all of this rich, fertile ground, and I simply can't escape it, which is why almost all of my work deals very intensely with family and with relationships. But I think for me, it comes down to the fact that that particular contrast is really, really interesting and fertile for me, and just continues to give me more material.
I love all of these answers so much. I think I'll just add that I think I am always processing and digesting in my work different shapes that family can make. So many of my characters are finding family in seemingly unconventional places, like in friendships, in casts of theater actors. Family is not only a shape, but I think an action and a verb in many of my stories. And I'm always working on an expansive definition of what that word can look like and the different forms it can take.
I don't know if you want us all to talk, so I'll just go. Yeah, I appreciated what everyone said. I think a lot of the things that I was thinking about have already been mentioned, but I think for me, writing about family is really writing about the self, and sort of mining the self, or making, for me, it's making the self, you know, and creating my own identity, and understanding the self it's nearly impossible without addressing family, and it's a path to discovery. But I think for me, I avoided writing about family for a long time because I was afraid to write about family. Obviously, people don't like to be written about, and some people don't. And so I had to wait until no one was really around anymore. And so that gave me the freedom to write about at least my mother and my father in ways that I couldn't have when they were alive. So, and then I now feel like I understand myself a lot better because of that process.
I love these responses. And something that I think about a lot is a well-known quote from Flannery O'Connor, which is, "The fact is that anybody who has survived his childhood has enough information about life to last him the rest of his days." And I'm wondering if all of you can speak to this quote and whether you agree or disagree with this idea, whether your material from your childhood influences a lot of what you write about.
I mean, the short answer for me would definitely be yes. I write a lot about childhood. I'm very interested in childhood. I think that it's such fertile ground. And I think the quote makes a lot of sense. You know, there's this sort of prevailing idea in the world that children are resilient. And I think that's true, but there's so much that goes into discovering and identifying that resilience and triggering that resilience to be there. And so, you know, a lot of times we talk about how part of the job of the writer is sort of sitting back and observing, and many of us that find ourselves pursuing writing as a career or as an occupation are people who do that. But as a society, we often place that job on children. There used to be this idea that children should be seen and not heard. And so I'm just always really interested in that idea. And I know that there are a lot of writers out there who write almost solely like from children's points of view. I'm not one of those, but I think a lot about the things that happen to us when we're very young and how our later lives end up mirroring those situations. And a lot of my writing, I think, likes to draw those connections.
I chose to frame my book up until age 12 because I wanted to focus on my core initial imprints in the world, core traumas, and that very universal and relatable time of being 3 or 4 feet tall and being bossed around by all the big people all around us and not really understanding what was going on and receiving everything with wonder and excitement and also fear. And Denne Michelle's completely right that those dynamics that we learned so early on just replicate themselves over the course of life. And in my adulthood, I can trace many experiences and instances to those years contained before age 12. But I also wrote with the hope of placing readers in my shoes during those years, experiencing everything firsthand as I experienced them. And the act of doing that, re-inhabiting my childhood body, really gave me newfound appreciation of the fact that children are born into the world with all of the light and strength and talent that we need, truly. And it's easy to forget that as an adult and easy to think we have to teach them and we have to do this, we have to mold them. I think our biggest duties as adults, as parents, as mentors, lawyers, whatever we may be, is to make sure that the structural and systemic barriers in our world do not diminish and erode what they have naturally come into the world with. And so I think the biggest gift that the act of writing this book gave me was that understanding and appreciation and that relationship to my inner child, which in turn allowed me to understand myself and the people around me better.
I was just going to say that my most recent book is about family members of mine and not about my personal family, and my book is about the things that we tell, the stories that families tell and how they're translated and dissembled among all of us. And, you know, we are who we are because we hear these stories. But there are the families. So that's my great aunt's family. And I've written about my personal family, my nuclear family, and then my divorced family and my now put together family of my kid and my new husband. And they continually put you in a different place in the world. And, you know, it's sort of everything is reflected on that. And, you know, it is very, very interesting, very amazing.
And I was just going to I was thinking about that quote initially, you know, anybody who has survived his childhood has enough information about life to last him the rest of his days, their days. I don't know if I totally agree with that now that I'm thinking about it, because I think there's, I feel like it has to be sort of childhood plus adult reflection. I mean, maybe that's stating the obvious, but I feel like there's so much wonder and trauma in childhood, but there was no way for me to unpack it until I had sort of gone through, you know, various stages of life. And for me, being sort of as old as I am, I feel like I was just telling an interviewer this morning that, I mean, it's only in the last few years that I feel like I have a sort of understanding of myself and have a kind of insert swear word attitude, you know, about everything. Just kind of, it doesn't matter to me anymore. You know, I just want to do what I want to do. And I feel like that I wouldn't have been able to reflect on my childhood if I hadn't sort of gone through all these other phases. And without those phases, it would have just been, you know, maybe, I don't know. I'm not thinking of metaphors right now. I've been sitting in this chair for 9 hours, so I can't think of a metaphor, but I do feel like it would just be sort of isolated on its own. And so I needed to go through all these adult stages, youth, adult, you know, and then 30s and 40s, you know, just kind of be able to finally unpack sort of my own childhood in a way that I think would be interesting to both myself and other people, possibly. And maybe I should just say interesting to myself.
Did you want us all to weigh in on this, Michele?
Yes, I did.
Okay, sorry. Then I will do that. Do I agree with that quote? I do. If the child is a writer, I think that there are plenty of people who have been through way more interesting things than I did as a child who will never write about them. And I think that there are people who have been through much less than I did as a child who write beautifully about them. And I feel like if you've also in some way in your childhood cultivated the ability to be an observer and to listen and to process what you've been through in a meaningful way, then yes, absolutely, childhood, anything really, is good fodder for the rest of your life.
These are wonderful answers. Thank you. So Qian Julie, in beautiful country, can we just talk about how gorgeous this cover is too, by the way? I love this. The book is amazing as well. And I was so moved by how you portrayed your mother through the persona of your childhood self. In the chapter Silk, which that was one of the chapters that I discussed with my new school students. But in that chapter, you talk about how your mother made everything a game. For instance, the crabs she let you play with before she cooked them for a meal, or the rice you ate at the sweatshop. I feel like so often the lives of undocumented immigrants are cast in shadows, but your memoir so often shines a light on the joy found amidst all the difficult moments of your childhood as well. And I'm wondering how you struck that balance while writing this book and revisiting all of these memories.
I really wanted to give a real experience to the readers of what it was like to be undocumented. And in mining my memory, speaking to my parents, reading my childhood diaries where I documented every mundane detail because I wanted to be Harriet the Spy and solve some great mystery in New York City, which I never got to do, but there's still time. I noticed that as an adult, I remember the hunger, being hungry all the time, looking over my shoulder, afraid the cops will come after us, afraid of deportation, anytime we heard the sound of boots on the ground. But in the diary, it was also of, I played this great game today at the sweatshop of cutting loose thread. My job was to find loose thread and cut. And each time I finished a piece, I got a cent. And so I started pulling at thread and creating loose thread just to cut it. And I remembered what it was like to be a child in a moment, especially with a wise and protective mother who, despite everything she was dealing with at the time, having gone from being a forefront computer scientist and math professor to someone who worked at a sweatshop, remembered that she still had a child next to her who couldn't quite process what had happened to their lives and made everything fun. And I think herein is the magic of childhood. My mother was someone who as a child didn't get to play very much. She grew up in the Cultural Revolution and had to take care of her younger brothers from as early as age 7, around the time when I immigrated here. So I think in my parents, as adults, even as older adults now, I observe this inherent playfulness and joyfulness because that never got to exude in its fullest extent in what you might think of as the appropriate time. So we all kind of remain these childish adults, but because of that, they were able to preserve this element of fun and joy and bring light even to that sweatshop room for me.
It's really masterful how you did that in your book, how you portrayed that. So thank you.
Thank you. And I'm honored that for your kind words and for you're teaching it in class. Thank you.
Of course. So Marie, there is a wonderful chapter in your beautiful novel, Parakeet, your most recent novel, where the narrator wakes up in her mother's body. And I'm quoting from this chapter. You write, her teeth are bonded. I run my tongue over the smooth porcelain, much better than my badly treated nubs. I've always been secretly proud of her complicated profile. I turn her chin in the mirror, admiring the way it cuts light. It is so visceral now that I possess it. I'm wondering if you can talk about the inspiration behind this part of the novel, a novel that really deals with family right from the beginning when the dead grandmother shows up in the shape of a bird. But I also want to know what it was like to consider the fusion of mother and child. I just found that so fascinating.
Absolutely. I would love to talk about that. So I come from a family and a culture where we carry our ancestors very much with us, whether they are dead or alive. We carry them in our names. My name, Marie-Helene. Marie is my grandmother. Helene is my mother. And, you know, the child is not the center of the house. The elders very much are revered. And so I actually grew up in the company of older women. And I feel like that has made all the difference in a lot of great ways. And so, you know, my mom raised us alone, my brothers and I, and she was always just my moon and stars, and still is. And so the mother in Parakeet is not based on my mother, but it is, as you probably very wisely suspected, a play on that very well-known witticism. One day we all wake up and we discover that we are our mothers. And so, you know, like I tend to do in speculative fiction, I made the metaphorical literal And I had the bride, who is very distanced from her mother, wake up literally embodying her mother. And the point of it was, way deeper than just a cheap gimmick. It was meant to show the bride that we cannot possibly imagine what even the people we think we know are going through at any given moment, especially, on the physical level. And so the bride gains this surprising understanding of the ailments that her mother has and how difficult it feels to be her every day. I think at one point she says it's like trudging through mud, this mother. And so, it's basically a riff on the metamorphosis, and also a tribute to the connection that mothers and daughters have no matter what their relationship is. And a tribute to my own mother in a way, and my grandmother and my great aunts, who really, really showed me what it's like to be a strong woman.
I love that it's honoring them, even if it's not based on them. I love that that's where this comes from. So Victoria, it's very exciting. I read the galley, but I just got the finished copy of your forthcoming book. It comes out when? This is the first event you're doing for it, I know, but it's out. Is it out next week?
No, I think it's October 12th. I don't know. I don't know how far. I can't think that far ahead. So
okay,
soon.
No problem. Yeah. Very soon. So anyway, it's so exciting to hold the finished copy. And this gorgeous book is made up of epistolary essays, many addressed to family members. And in a letter to your father, you write, "I have had so many funerals for you, Father. I hide my hands in my pockets because they are always covered with dirt." I'm wondering if you could talk about the epistolary form and how it allowed you to address grief, silence, and understanding your parents, even when you can no longer have conversations with them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think for me, form, as a poet, form is always one of the things that we can mess around with. And for me, it's always sort of the vessel in which I can explore things very freely. I mean, it sounds constraining, but I think of form, and this is Terrence Hayes talking, as like a bird flying around in a cage. I would modify that to be like my bird actually occasionally leaves the cage and comes back, sort of thing. I find form very freeing and allows me to get out of my own way as a writer, and to kind of get rid of any preconceived notions. And so the epistolary form is super important for me in that, silence was a big part of my growing up. I had a sister that struggled with a disease related to her hair that was not talked about. There are a lot of secrets all the time. And so it's not that if my mother was alive, I would ask her questions necessarily. So the epistolary form was a way of sort of mimicking this kind of idealized relationship where I could have asked her questions when she was alive. And it allowed me to be open and free, to sort of ask whatever questions I wanted, and to be speculative and to be imaginative. And in that way, it was a path of discovery, in that I think that I was looking for answers, but I ended up realizing that it wasn't really answers that I was seeking, but the freedom to live within silence, and sort of accepting that that was sort of my fate, just given the situations that my parents were in, and the kinds of people that they were, and the traumas that they experienced. My mother too had left China before the Cultural Revolution, but we have whole sets of families on the other side that are still there that I don't know. And so there was quite a bit of trauma there, but I think it was the form that allowed me to be able to ask all the questions that I've always wanted to, not expecting answers, which was in many ways very freeing.
I love that you mentioned that it became speculative, because that was one of the things I really loved about this book, or the moments when you enter into the imaginative realm for the answers that you can't have, but when you imagine things that might have happened too. So thank you for this book.
Thanks for reading it.
Of course. Julie, I really, really loved your new book, The Almost Legendary Morris Sisters. It's just such a wonderful, it's a page turner, it really is. And I love this quote in the beginning of it. You say, trying to find the truth in your family is a balancing act between learning facts and learning what people thought. Can you expand on this idea and talk about how it informed your research in your book?
Well, there was so much. I was told this story about these relatives of mine when I was growing up, and everybody had a very emphatic, this is what happened. One of them had an affair with J.P. Morgan. Another one had her script stolen, and, you know, from a Broadway producer who was coming on to her. You know, they had this incredible story. They were orphaned. Supposedly their mother, they were coming from Romania, going to Los Angeles, and this was the turn of the century, where their father was supposed to be a movie director. Supposedly the mother died in childbirth, and the kids were put in an orphanage, and then they pulled themselves out to do all of these amazing things. And then it turned out that wasn't what happened. And when I started to look into it, I was looking into the story of what happened. Like, I wanted to just write it and find out the details of the things that happened. It was so interesting. And like it started with me going to the Morgan Library, and like picking up a biography and realizing that the one who was supposed to have an affair with him had died. He died when she was 12 and in an orphanage in St. Louis. So I was like, okay, that doesn't check out. And then kind of going on. And it was, and so I think that we, what was the question you asked again? I'm sorry. My dog is in the hospital, and I was getting texts. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay.
I sort of lost my sense.
I hope your dog is okay.
I'm so sorry.
I was asking about the quote that you said, trying to find the truth in your family is a balancing act between learning facts and learning what people.
Well, because we want to be who we hear these stories from our family, and we want to be who they tell us we are. And our parents tell us these stories about things that happen to our families, and we're excited by them and want to become that. And then, there's the reality. And so you have to sort of surf for it. And, to me, the reality, there are these things that people were embarrassed about at a certain point in time that we read now and are really proud of the things that they went through. It's not embarrassing. And so, there was a lot of that, and a lot of uncovering these realities and stories, and finding that, the truth was much more interesting and impactful. So.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And last but certainly not least, Denne Michele, in one of your short stories, I Know How This Dream Ends, which was published in McSweeney's recently, right? Was this last year that this came out?
Yeah.
That's what I thought. Your main character is a 10-year-old, and the character falls asleep during church services. And you write, "I'll never know if I'm saved because Mama pinches my arm when she catches me dozing. She hisses in my ear, telling me to wake up. I hate the way she sounds when she does that, like a snake slithering under my feet." Such a great description. I'm wondering if you can talk about this story and how the relationship between the mother and the narrator is central to what you wanted to write about, because I thought that it was so well done, and I'd love to hear about this.
Oh, thank you. That's absolutely true. This story took 11 years to write. But from the first time I ever started it to publication day, 11 years. I was not writing it for many of those years. It was sort of, I would have these intense periods where I would work on it and then put it away and all of that. But one of the things that was interesting to me is that from the very beginning of the very first draft, I understood that this was a story in which a mother was in many ways not mothering their child, and that this was a story in which a mother was actively choosing to or accepting harm for their child, and doing it, I think, as people often do, because they think that it may be the greater good. The story also went through many sort of versions, but I always understood that I wanted to just like look at this relationship a little bit differently. And it was something that I had really never written about. The vast majority of my fiction deals with relationships between fathers and sons, with mothers sometimes even absent or like not very present. And in this story, I just had a really different idea. But I also really wanted to make it clear that this is a mother who's sort of putting her best foot forward and in a lot of ways doing the best that she can. And maybe doesn't give herself that grace at the end. I don't know. Does that sort of make sense based on your reading of it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the ending in particular, I don't want to spoil anything, but everyone should read it. But the ending just really hit me hard. Oh my gosh, the end. I'm not surprised to hear that it took a long time to write. I feel like I can really relate to that. I'm a writer who, like, my long reads essay that led to my anthology took well over a decade to write. There are certain stories that we have to spend a lot of time on for whatever reason.
Yes. Yeah. Stories and books.
Yes, absolutely. I have a question that I know everyone in the audience is thinking about right now. And so I want to talk about something that comes up a lot for me as a writing teacher, and also when I was on book tour. I have been asked again and again, and I'm sure some or all of you have as well, to give someone else permission to write about their family members. And I always tell them that that permission has to come from within, and that's not something that I can give them, right? But it's really such a delicate and important topic, because there can be serious consequences in writing about loved ones, no matter what genre you're writing in. In fact, I'll never forget, I think it might have been Denne Shapiro saying, when I saw her at an event once, talking about how people had recognized themselves more in fiction than in her nonfiction. I think it was Denne who said that. But yeah, like I've heard multiple stories of people seeing themselves in a fictional character. And so can we talk about the ethics of writing about people you're related to, or letting fictional characters resemble a family member if you're writing fiction too? But I just love, this is a big topic. How do we do this? How do we do this so that we're not hurting people? Yeah, I'd love to hear what anyone has to say about that.
It took me a long time to wrap my mind around it, because the core of my story is a secret that I was obligated to keep by virtue of being undocumented. And added on top of that, my father's whole childhood was marked by the fact that his older brother, at age 18, when my father was just 6 years old, wrote a piece criticizing the Chinese government that got the entire family labeled as traitors and dissidents, and pretty much shaped my father's entire life and identity. So the act of writing this book was terrifying to me, because of what it meant to me to share the secret that I had wrapped my identity around. But even more so, it was terrifying to me in that I did not want to first kick up this old fear of deportation and the government coming after us, even though we are all now legal, and also triggering my father's deep-seated traumas that are very valid based on what he grew up in. So my first attempt in writing this book was to novelize it and fictionalize it, but and that was in college and I was just too young. I had not fully processed everything that had happened. But because the issue here is one that is inherently or feels inherently shameful to those who are labeled by others as undocumented or worse, illegal, the fact that I couldn't own it in writing a book meant that it lost pretty much all of its power. And I knew that upon finishing that version of the book. So I just let it sit and didn't work on it at all. But it kept coming back to me that I needed to tell this story. The truth needed to be told, and our humanity needs to have a spotlight on it. And not to say that I intend to speak for all immigrants or all undocumented immigrants. I could never hope to do that, but to show the real life dimensions that go beyond the headlines. So once I came back at this and said, no, I have to write this as memoir, every time I thought about anybody reading it at all, I shut down. How could I do this to my parents? How could I do this to my father, especially? So I just told myself this book was never going to get written. And I wrote it on my subway commute to my law firm on my notes app. And I just told myself I was texting myself notes to leave behind for my future children and grandchildren, because they deserve to know the truth. They deserve to know what it was really like to get their family here and where they come from. And that was, I guess, the permission I needed. I felt that I owed it to the people to come in our family to know what had happened before they were born. And yeah, so I think that my situation was particular, and like you say, Michelle, we can't give permission to anyone, but if it helps anyone struggling with this at all, when my husband forced me to tell my father that I debuted #3 on the New York Times bestsellers list, which I was terrified to do because I know his immediate thought was, everyone in the world is reading this book. It is about me. Everyone now knows ICE is going to come for me right now. I was terrified. My father said, one, I'm so proud of you, which I had never heard before in my life. Anyone who has a Chinese father or Asian father knows how rare that is. And two, he said, good, there is nothing we are afraid of now. So my hope that the act of writing this book could transform that trauma into a piece of empowerment for me, for those around me, just the act of believing in it brought it about, at least for the three of us. So I hope that lends some hope to those out there struggling with this.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Does anyone else have anything to add about this topic, the ethics of writing about family?
I would just say, of course, it's really complicated. And for a long time, the only thing that I could think about was I have to do what's right for my art. That has to come first. And then it was at a panel of really fabulous women writers that I saw at McNally Jackson, I think 5 or 6 years ago. It was Taiye Selasi and Elliot Holt and Mira Jacob and a few others. And they all talked about how they had handled that in different ways. And Tiffany Anik was there, and she was the one who was like, I showed my novel to someone in my family, and they said that if you publish this in this form, I'll never speak to you again. And so I changed it, and it made the work better. And I do not think that's a choice that I'm going to make as I'm finishing mine up, but it made me feel like wherever you land in terms of how you treat your work and how it interacts with your personal life, that whatever decision you make, you can make it be the right decision for you. And it made me feel so empowered because I felt like I wasn't being a traitor to my art if I considered my family's desires and needs when publishing work. And I suspect that, knock on wood, should my book enter the world, there will be some feelings.
I'm of a couple different minds on the subject as someone who writes pretty much only fiction. Recently, I just published a creative nonfiction essay / craft essay for Electric Literature called On Magic. And it was the first time I actually talked about my private life, my personal life, and especially, most notably, abuse that I experienced as a kid. And I was really nervous about it. It took me a long time to phrase that particular paragraph. And the reason that I did that was because I had seen another person who had experienced abuse give a speech, and it helped me. And I thought, okay, that is a reason to do it. I will do that because that person gave me a particular permission to make things up, and I feel like I can convey that, and that would be worthwhile. But the phrasing, I mean, it took me forever to do it in the way that felt honest to the way that I am. Because I also have to say that many times in my teaching, it comes up that I give fiction students the permission to not write about their families, that they actually are wrestling with the ethics because they feel in some way pressured to write about their own experience, and they don't feel like they should have to in some way. And so it's interesting to me that it kind of goes both ways. I am someone for whom the ethics is extremely important. There are living people in my life whose stories are not mine to tell. And so I always want to make sure that I'm not intruding into what's theirs to tell because of ego on my part in any way. And so, you know, as I said before, I don't tend to write about my personal life. However, the novel that is coming out next year or the year after, Beautyland, is the closest I've ever come to writing about my childhood in Philadelphia. And so I decided to let my mom read it at a really early stage. And that was the first time she's ever read an early draft. And I asked her, you know, how do you feel that you've, you know, appeared in my fiction here and there in veiled ways? This was late at night, one of our like one-to-one talks that happened occasionally that I actually treasure very much. And she said, oh, you know, I know that I'm in your stories as this person or that person here and there. And she says, you know, I feel really honored. I feel honored to be in your story. And however you want to write about me, I think is great, because you writing about me is me too. Like that's good for me, and it's good for you to be a writer. And she's always really been proud of that, even though we do not come from people who are writers. We're not, you know, I didn't grow up knowing any writers. My mother didn't know any writers. This is very new for my family. And I felt really honored that she would trust me in that way, and trust me with her story, and trust me with her likeness. So it actually is something that I think about a lot, and I make it up more times than I source directly from my life. And quite honestly, as far as fiction goes, many times that is very useful to fabricate it somehow, because it doesn't quite work one-to-one all the time. So if anyone is there who feels pressured to write about their life and doesn't necessarily feel ready to, you also can wait, and you can not be ready, and you can also, you know, make it up and write about a dragon. I give you permission. A dragon that looks like your mother.
Now I want to read that story. So Victoria and Julie, do you have anything to add to that?
I mean, I guess the only thing I would add is that what I often tell students when they're in the drafting phase of anything, you know, whether it's a poem or a short story or a memoir or anything, is just, you know, just don't think about the audience and just write, you know, and understand that memory is slippery, and we do the best that we can, and all those other things you can worry about later. So that's like way over there. So when you're writing, it's joyful, it's truth seeking, it's identity making, it's all the things that we love about the creation process. You're making a piece of something, you're making a sculpture, you're making a piece of art, and to enjoy that process unfiltered and deal with all the other stuff later, and just get the stuff on the page, because writing is a journey of the self, you know, and I think people get ahead of themselves too when they're writing memoir. I think so much about the audience or the characters or this or that. And, you know, I think that's later. You can deal with that later, because you can always revise anything out or change facts, or I've done that, change facts, and then you put your little thing at the end and say all facts have been changed, or, you know, people, it's like, you know, you just have to put that language in the back. And again, memory is slippery. What is memory? You know, like all of us will remember this event differently, and understanding that and just sort of trusting yourself and in the artistic process is, I think, one of the joys of writing.
You know, I was just going to say that I feel like it depends on what you're writing about, what the point is. You know, my first book that was a memoir about my relationship with my mother, you know, I felt like she was coming from a place that she was coming from, and I didn't want to make any statements about what she had done. I mean, she didn't do anything bad. She let me come home from school a lot, not really sick, and go to Bloomingdale's and go shopping with her. And she came from an orbit that she came from, and I wanted to sort of tell that story and let that be, you know, just tell it and not put anything on it. Let people decide what they feel like. But when she read the first draft, she was not comfortable with a couple of things in it. And I was perfectly happy to make those changes, because I adore her and only wanted that to be, you know, I was telling my story. I wasn't telling her story. And, you know, I have a child, and when my child was young, I would write a lot of funny things that they said and, you know, blah, blah, blah. And then when they were 13, they came out as trans, and I wrote this story that I wrote an essay in Oprah magazine, which he read before was published. That was important for me to sort of, I felt like that was going to help a lot of parents of kids who were figuring their way out. But the most important thing for me was for my kid to be okay with it. If they weren't, I was like, you know, I don't give a fuck about anybody else. I care about my kid. I care about my mother. I hope that if they're okay with it, it helps other people. And that was really my main goal. I mean, you know, and you know, it did. I think when they're okay with it, it comes across in a loving way, and you do better with it. I mean, you don't want to come across as some, you know, there are people who've written things that don't feel like they've been okayed, and things don't necessarily get okayed. But I just wanted to, I have very good relationships with the people that I write about, and I don't want to jeopardize that. So.
Thank you for these responses. This is wonderful. We have time really quickly for one or two questions from the audience. So the first one is from Sarah Knowles. When writing about family members, how do you approach the process of mining their real life quirks for great character descriptions? So do any of you want to answer that?
That I can speak to, because I am I unmuted? Yes. I do allow for that, because that is important to notice and source with idiosyncratic, specific, and surprising details. And radically noticing, I think, is important for writing. And so I keep a little notebook of character quirks from friends and family. I do ask them if it's okay that I use them. One of the best ones I've ever heard that was useful in my first novel was my friend Beth, who one day mentioned to me that every time a character on TV shrugs, she shrugs too, no matter what. And I thought that was so wild and unique. And I needed something like that to connect a mother and daughter, actually, in a mother who had passed and her daughter, in my novel 2 a.m. at the Cat's Pajamas. So I borrowed Beth's quirk. after asking her if I could. But I think that is okay. And I also wanted to mention that quote. I think it's Ann Beatty who said, people who are worried about being written about in a disparaging way should have performed better in real life.
And
sometimes, oh, thank you. Okay. Sometimes I think about that and I'm like, yeah, you know, some people are totally on limits.
Does anyone have anything to add to that real quick?
I would just, the one thing that I would add to that, first, I completely agree with that sentiment. And I say this to people I'm dating all the time. Like, I'm on a podcast that has a lot of listeners. Like, anything, I might talk about you. And that goes to all kinds of ways. But the thing that I would just second with that is that then, like in my case, I always have to think about the language that I'm going to use to do the description sometimes. And that's not just always there. And so I find it to really important to also be as observant of like how the behavior that you're writing about makes you feel, like how you receive it when you notice it, or when you hear it, or when the person touches you, or if it's not, like, if you're not a part of that interaction, then like sort of trying to surmise that and think through what that might look like, because that might give you the language that you need to use to make a description. Like when I think about that moment that Michelle, that you read from my story, like deciding to use the image of a snake and a serpent in the context of church had to do with how, and my mother used to do that. She would pinch me if I fell asleep in church. It had to do with how that made me feel. Like, and so I just think that that's a really important thing to think about as well.
I think the language is really important. For me in my book, I think a lot about language in that I want to give the experience of someone learning English. So I use Pinyin Chinese and it seeps out as I become more fluent. But because I was thinking so consciously of language, I wanted to think about how language showed my parents' quirks. And there was this one strong quote that was seared into my memory of my dad saying that he would rather eat America's shit than feast on China's fruits. And I felt like someone who would say that, just by you hearing that quote, you can kind of imagine who he is. And so for me, there were a lot of phrasings and sentences of the ways my parents talked about the world that really showed their idiosyncrasies. And so I think language is a keystone to that.
Did you have anything to add to that, Julie or Victoria, or just wanted to give you the chance to respond if you wanted to? No? Okay.
I actually have a question, Michelle, if you don't mind. Because I was thinking, I have also been written about, and I would love to know if, you know, what all of my fellow writers think about that. You know, like I said, my mother was very honored that I wrote about her here and there, but I was also presented with the question, do you mind if I write about you? And I felt like, surprisingly, like, well, what are you going to write? And can I see it before it goes out? And things like that. And then, because my mother had been so gracious, stopped and said, actually, whatever you decide to do is fine. You know, that's your art, that's your thing. And so from the other side, have any of you ever had that experience, like of being written about?
My brother, Matthew, is a fiction writer, and he has written short stories and novels about everybody in our family except me. And I have gotten to the point where I am like, can I do something to get into them? Am I not interesting enough? You know, I try to be insane, but I have not gotten into any of them. And I will read a new story and think, damn it, there is another one. So, I mean, I do think what you're saying is people do like it. I had written a story, an essay about this ex-boyfriend I had who was a mafioso, terrible person. And it was in Glamour magazine, and they said, you have to call him and ask him if it's okay. And I was like, you know, he owed me $1 zillion and was, you know, on the run, whatever. And I called and said, you know, Glamour's making me say, is it okay to write about you? And he said, yeah, but why did you change my name? No one's going to know it's me. And, that's my story.